Hi, everyone. I'm Peter Schein, and I wanted to thank you all for taking some time to listen to what Ed and I have to say. It's a great honor, and we want to thank the Indian Society for Applied Behavioral Science for inviting us to do this today. So as I said, I'm Peter Schein, and next to me is Ed Schein. I think most of you may know who he is. But as a way of getting us started, I thought we might see, Ed, if you want to comment just on the sort of the arc of about 50 or 60 years of organization development from your perspective. Do you have any reflections?
Well, Peter, it's a great question because I think the sort of underlying theory that Kurt Lewin brought to social psychology, that we should shift from everybody teaching and telling, that there's more to be learned by learning and listening and interacting. So for me, it was not only important that I had a background in sociology and anthropology, but that within 2 years of coming to MIT, under the aegis of Douglas McGregor, who was an important founder of this whole field, he sent me off to NTL, which at that time was a 3-week workshop. And I learned for the first time what the difference is between academic knowledge, of which I had a great deal, and experiencing the very group and interpersonal phenomena that I thought I knew all about. So the big insight, and forever has stayed with me as the key to what we as coaches and organization development folks, practitioners, what we do is we facilitate learning, which started in the T group. When the trainer opened the session by saying, "We're here to learn about ourselves," and then fell silent, and we were all sitting there with great anxiety, that was the key moment that opened the next 60 years of what today we call experiential learning, which is the base of OD and is appropriate because in today's open systems, complex, interdependent world, teaching is almost irrelevant, whereas learning in this world is where it's all at. And we as organization development practitioners have become something of experts at creating learning situations. And that has kept me going right now till into my 90s. I feel as strongly about all this as I ever did.
Yeah, that's great. So Ed and I started working together about 5 years ago. And one of the first things he said is, you know, we've got lots we want to do together, consulting and writing books. But he said, one of the first things you need to do, Peter, meaning what I needed to do, was I needed to go to a National Training Labs T group. So I did that up in Seattle and at the end of 2015. It was quite an experience. And I knew all about this because my wife had been at the Stanford Business School a while ago, and they had a class on group dynamics that's affectionately known as touchy-feely at the Stanford Business School. But it did sort of raise an interesting prospect for me that going into this T group, I knew that it was going to be, as Ed said, it was going to be very experiential. It was going to be very personal. It was going to be very unsettling. And I was going to learn a ton. I was going to learn a ton about myself, and I was going to learn a ton about how groups work. But interestingly, I did have an experience of some of the other people there that I got the sense that the focus was more on the individual and quote unquote fixing the individual or sensitivity training was a term that I heard used. And in a conversation afterwards, Ed and I had about my experience at the T group. Ed asked me how much of the focus of the T group was on individuals versus on the group, and how the group was learning to be a group. Do you remember that conversation, Ed?
I certainly do.
And what was your thinking, and did it give you a sense of have we gone in the right direction?
That is very observant of what I feel problematic today, because when I went to that 3-week workshop at that time, a great deal of the emphasis was on learning how groups work. And the most exciting part of the workshop actually was when the T groups were put into competition with each other. And we discovered that a lot of the learning that we had when we were just our own group, and we got very cozy with each other, and we came to believe that we were a perfect group, only to discover that once we were in competition with another group, the climate suddenly changed drastically. People to whom we had been listening politely suddenly got overridden because we suddenly felt time pressure, and we organized into formal roles. And I then realized how much what we teach today interpersonally, whether it's in T groups or workshops or whatever, has drifted dangerously into just personal development. Let the person experience something and then give them feedback so that they can grow and be a better leader, a better manager, a better whatever. That is very much the announced workshop goal, for example, of some of these business school programs like the one at Stanford. And I think we should worry about this, because the serious problems of organization development turn out to be that groups don't work together, groups compete, the silos that are created in most organizations are not coordinating and don't often even know what each other is doing. So one of the things that I worry about today in our consulting is how we get people to pay attention to something more than experiential exercises for personal growth, and how we get back to experiential exercises for groups and intergroup relationships, because that's where I think the bigger problems reside in most organizations today.
Yeah, I would echo that. In the for the audience, I spent about 30 years in Silicon Valley in different management roles, and in particular in corporate development. And I think there was a number of things that were going on in corporate development, but our group itself, we had a small team of people. And I can remember many instances where we're working with OD and HR, and we were doing things like the MBTI, the Myers-Briggs assessment, or some other assessment about our leadership development or our leadership talents. And in order to sort of, coach us toward, learning how to be better leaders or learning how to be better managers. But never once did I feel like those assessments or that lens that was being focused on the individual was actually being focused on the functioning of the team. We were a highly interdependent group of people who were going out and looking at companies to invest in or companies to acquire. and then all the way to the groups in human resources and in other functional groups in the organization that would be responsible for integrating any kinds of acquisitions that we did. And this idea that we were spending so much time focusing on our individual talents and skills and individual development, and not actually looking to the improving the function of our team, that again was so highly interdependent, did strike me as I mean, it struck me and didn't strike me at the time. It strikes me in retrospect that we might have diverted some of our effort away from these individualistic leadership development exercises and toward, as you were saying, as toward sort of group development exercises. What do you think's behind that? Do you have a sense of why we would have been doing it that way?
Well, I think the obvious answer, which also leads to what you and I are both now very concerned about, is that the culture of the US, the culture of capitalism, the culture of development tends to always put all the responsibility or accountability for learning, for improvement, for leadership on the individual. And all our theories pay lip service to relationship building. But I think we have found it necessary in our recent books to say, wait a minute, the word relationship is just a word. And until you define some kind of a ladder of different levels of relationship, just to announce we need relationships, you haven't said anything. So the big change that I see necessary and that we have begun to really push on is to put into all our writings this notion of a ladder of leadership that has at least 4 levels, ranging from at the deepest level of relationship, which is pure emotional intimacy, what we have with our best friends and family, to a level of professional intimacy where we know each other well enough so that we are open and trust each other, to a lesser level of transactionalism, which is the common element in most of our relational activities, and I think is the sort of the main proposition underlying the culture of management, that management is defined as a set of transaction between managers in their roles and employees in their roles. And that, unfortunately, as we all know, even can drift into the lowest level, which we call -1, because it is not really a positive relationship, it's a negative relationship, is where the leader, the boss, decides that the right way to manage is to dominate people, to tell them what to do and make all the incentives work so that people have to obey. The sweatshop, the prison, the places where you not only have to obey, but you can't leave because you need the job. And what we're beginning to realize is that the new leadership, the new management is a group sport, is a relational activity, and it has to at least get to the level of professional intimacy. We don't necessarily have to become friends with our colleagues and our bosses and the people below us. But we have to get personal enough in the work setting to be able to say to each other what's really on our mind and what we really need to do to get the job done better, to innovate, to overcome obstacles. And in this open environment of complexity and interdependence, how we coordinate, not by competing to see who wins, but by figuring out how we can collaborate to produce a better job. So it even leads to the idea that organizations are not collections of people, but collections of relationships. And those relationships should aim, and the organization development community should help companies aim in that direction toward these level 2 personalized, professionally intimate relationships.
Yeah, so you used a term there that you knew I would come back to. But before I do, I want to actually circle back on one other thing, because one thing that we've talked about a lot is that some of this has to do with our conception of the organization. That in the, we've often said that whole Taylorism, or the Frederick Taylor model, that I guess was sort of started in the 30s, 40s, 50s, this conception of the organization as when it's operating best, it's operating like a well-oiled machine. And the image of that is that there are lots of distinct parts of the machine that are working together. They're passing energy between different parts of the machine. And if they're well-oiled, this transfer of power happens very fluidly. But it is this idea of power essentially being handed off between roles in order to get something produced. Now, I think we're starting to see, and we're not alone in this, there are lots of people who are sort of urging us all to conceive of the organization as something a little bit different. You've said a network of relationships. Generally we're talking about something that's much more organic and adaptive, more like a carbon-based life form than a metal-based machine. So, are we getting there? Have we gotten to a better sort of conception of what an organization really is? Or are we just sort of trying to talk about it that way, but we're not actually changing our organizations to behave that way?
I think in our field of organization development, we have bought into that early, because Kurt Lewin, one of his important sayings was that you don't really understand an organization until you try to change it. You can theorize all you want about what an organization is the machine, is it this or that? But as change agents, when we got an opportunity to talk to a client, what we discovered was the other tool that Kurt Lewin provided, which was very useful, which was called force field analysis. Lewin's view of what life is a quasi-stationary equilibrium between the hundreds of forces that are acting on us all the time. And new forces come up. Sometimes we have to defend against them. Sometimes we give in to them. But the only way to think about it is in terms of a multiple force field. And as many of you know, that proves to be a very useful diagnostic tool when we look at, for example, resistance to change, to make a list, not of, oh yeah, that's just human nature, but to make a list of the actual structures and processes and cultural norms that are single forces, all of which are keeping the change force from pushing toward where the manager or we, the consultant, might want it to go. So the idea of multiple force fields also plays out that human systems and this is a very important principle, human systems are really different from physical systems. We keep trying to do research on the physical model and don't recognize that you can't have human control groups. You can't put humans into experiments without all kinds of collateral damage being done. And so once you accept that human systems are different, you also then have to say the influence process of how we change a human system also has to be different. And that leads us to the varieties of OD processes, of which there are now many, that are now almost competing with each other to see which is the right way to tackle a given client problem that an organization or a manager brings to us. But human systems are fundamentally different.
Yeah, and you've used that term, everything is an intervention. I think that's been important for me as I've tried to learn from you, that it's one thing to experiment with an algorithm or to experiment with even the tuning on a physical machine. But when you show up as a consultant, you can't experiment with human beings in the same way. We're way too smart. Our memory is too long. So if something gets tinkered around with in the way we're doing our work or the way we're treating each other, it's not as easy to just untinker it. You intervene and you create a reaction. And we have to learn that anytime we enter into those sort of interventions, we are changing the thing that we're touching.
I think that's not only a central point, but it's kind of a key point that brings together a lot of what we've been talking about. This notion that OD has an entry level and a contracting level and then a data gathering level. I believe, and I think I mostly convinced Peter of this, that those stages are inventions of academicians who have never been out in the field. That anyone who's actually done any change realizes that when someone is on the telephone and says to me, Professor Schein, we have a culture problem. Could you help us develop a culture analysis of our company? Everything I say from that moment on is already an intervention. And I might, depending on the tone of voice, on the content of what the other person is saying, might have to go through an instant process of deciding in what way will I intervene at this moment. Will I say, tell me more, because maybe that culture stuff looks interesting, or I might sense that that's just the way the person chose to present themselves to me, and I might say, wait a minute, why are you worried about your culture? Which takes it a completely different direction. Or I might say, well, just tell me a little bit more about what's going on. Engaging in humble inquiry. And I've kind of learned that those interventions set the tone for the relationship from that point on. So you can, at that point, be one kind of OD consultant, working from the traditional model, and then say later on, I'm going to become a dialogic consultant and be more concerned about more open systems thinking and stuff. If I want to be a dialogic consultant who really takes seriously that everything is an open system And it's all about building an immediate relationship with that first client who's on the phone. The next thing I have to say is whatever will build the relationship. I have to become dialogic from the moment I open my mouth. Or if we're at a meeting together, from the moment I display body language, I have to be positive, I have to be interested. The best solution is to be the humble inquirer, because I don't know enough to second guess where this relationship might go. And I think that's the big message that I want to leave with you. No matter what style of consulting you use, I think the humble inquiry approach to beginning in a dialogic format, trying to figure out what's really going on so that your interventions at every point become a joint effort to build a relationship. That's where I think the future of OD will lie. That every contact with every phase of a big project, the relationships all have to be level 2 professionally intimate relationships, or people will start lying and spinning, competing, and not telling each other what's going on, which will undermine openness and trust. How's that
But we have lots of, oh, sorry.
I'm just quipping. How is that for a final message to you, all of you out there, all over the world?
Well, it's important. It's a good one. But at the same time, there are so many good survey instruments available to us. And there's so many good ways of sort of dropping a study onto the organization and then stepping back and analyzing it after the fact. Why can't we just do that?
Because I think the human system is not only different from mechanical systems, but is also a multi-layered system. And the problem with the survey is that it's too superficial a layer of behavior. In other words, to study an organization, for example, or its culture, through the check marks that some employees, often just a small sample of employees, makes on a survey which designed only the questions that I'm interested in, is a very poor sample of that human organization. So if, for example, we were doing the culture stuff, I would say, well, eventually you might end up wanting to do a survey for comparative purposes. But if you want to know that organization at that point in time, you have to do diagonal group meetings with facilitators and talk about what is going on here on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
What do we think of as the norms by which we operate here? How does our reward system really work? Not just what's in the manuals and what's in the survey responses, but the actual observed behavior.
Right. Yeah, one of the great pleasures for me in working with you over the last few years is being able to go back to my undergraduate college training in social anthropology and rediscovering people like Clifford Geertz and Marshall Solins. And in particular, the Geertz comment that talking about the interpretation of culture in general, as the trick is to figure out what the devil they think they're up to. And that's just sort of, just in that line alone, it begs that we go in and we walk in their shoes. We try to understand what's going on. And the only way as OD professionals that people can really do that is to get to a level of openness and trust with the people that they're working with, so that it's not a study. It's sharing information. It's a joint interpretation. It goes back to learning together rather than learning from a distance. And so this brings me back with the few minutes we have remaining to that word that you used earlier, personized. I'll just tell the folks out there that the story on that is that we wanted to create a term that distinguished that process of creating a whole person to whole person relationship that was truly open and trusting, that truly allowed what's really going on to be surfaced, that was different than the word personalize, which has tended to mean, you can have, a personalized healthcare plan, or you can have a personalized HR benefits plan, but that is not the same thing. And so personized was sort of an accidental term that we decided was important for us to start using, and we apologize to the field for creating another term, but do hope that distinction resonates, that it's describing that process of developing the relationship between a manager and his or her group, or between an OD consultant and the subjects that consultant is working with, that getting to that level 2 relationship, open, trusting, personized, is how information is going to have to be exchanged, because otherwise information gets hidden or it gets overlooked. And it's in those white spaces, in that maybe it's what's not said, that so much of the truth lies for OD to sort out and figure out, because it's what they think is going on, not just what you think is going on, that matters.
Well, I would like to sum up, since we have used up most of our, even more of our half hour, with this idea. It's about relationships, and that leadership is a group sport, and therefore, for you as practitioners, the most important thing is to learn how to be helpful around group dynamics, interpersonal dynamics, intergroup dynamics, because if we don't solve those problems at the organizational or at the intergroup or even intercountry level, we're not going to solve the big problems that climate change and economic and political problems are facing us. So go forth with leadership as a group sport, and everything is a relationship, and the world is a set of relationships. Thanks for listening to us, and I hope you have a wonderful meeting.
Yes, thank you very much for this. Again, this is a great honor for us to be able to do this, and best of luck and best wishes for improving organizations across the planet. Thank you.